Well, today we're going to begin a 6-week series on the story of Esther. We're going to take this 6-week journey. It's going to conclude on Easter Sunday. You all, if you've been here long enough, you know I like making things unpredictable for people. So when people walk in on Easter Sunday, like, aren't we going to be talking about Jesus? Yes. But we're going to talk about Jesus in a way that presents him differently, because let me just explain my heart on this. If you only came to church at Christmas and Easter, and you heard the same message every Christmas and every Easter, and you never heard anything different, it would be kind of boring, right? So I like to mix things up on people that think, well, I'm just going to go and hear the same old story about Jesus as a little baby or Jesus on the cross. I like mixing things up because at the heart of it, the story of Esther is the story of Easter. And you're going to see what I mean by that, because Esther, right off the bat, we have Esther. This is one of the only books in the Bible that's named after a female. A lot of times when we have the book of Esther, here's where Esther gets relegated to. It's Mother's Day. There is a female that's speaking, preaching, and they get to preach on like Ruth, Esther, Mary, Martha, Mary the mother of Jesus, and you get to hear about a woman speaking about one of the women in the Bible. This story, especially as I'm really breaking it down, I've spoke on Esther before, but I've never just did a series on Esther. And as I break this down and prepare for each of these messages, I've got the first 3 written. I realize there's a lot going on here in a way that I think I've just kind of even skimmed when I've read it in the past, that there is so much drama in this story, it's incredible. Who needs a soap opera when you have the book of Esther? And the thing is, we think, oh, Esther, and we hear that like statement that happens, and we'll hear it in our 3rd week of the series, of maybe you are appointed for such a time as this. There is drama in that, because that statement just feels so good of like, God has placed you exactly where you are for such a time as this. But when we get there, you're going to realize that Mordecai is setting up Esther and then almost guilting her into it. It's interesting how you see some of these different things play out. And one of the things that I want you to realize is that while Esther is the linchpin that makes this story work, one of the things that we realize is every single major character in this story helps move this narrative forward of what's going to be happening in here. The book of Esther was written most likely by a Jew who was very familiar with the royal Persian court, but is unknown. We don't know who wrote the book of Esther. The detailed descriptions of the court life and the traditions and the event in the book point to an eyewitness author, somebody who was there, who experienced it and saw it all play out. The perspective of this book is very pro-Jewish, so we can kind of safely assume that it's a Jew who wrote it. A lot of individuals have suggested that Mordecai himself was the author of the book of Esther, although at the same time you have all these accolades that are thrown Mordecai's way. So some of those scholars think that, well, maybe a younger contemporary wrote the book of Esther, someone who was with Mordecai but wasn't Mordecai. But at the same time, that hasn't stopped anyone from writing some unique things about themselves in the Bible. Moses wrote that he was the most humble person. Chew on that for a moment. You have John, who wrote that he was the most beloved disciple of Jesus. So it wouldn't put it past Mordecai to write some of these very things about himself. At the end of the day, though, the book is named for the star of the story, a young Jewish girl named Hadassah, except that she goes by the Persian name of Esther, and she is forced to go into a beauty pageant with the idea that she might be crowned the next bachelorette. I say that kind of loosely, but that's really kind of what's playing out here when we go through this 1st and 2nd chapter today. There's all kinds of stuff that's going on in here, and I don't think at the beginning of the story, Esther really believes that by the end of the story that she's going to be the queen and is going to save her people. She just is kind of trying to go through the motions and make it through life. And here's one of the most interesting things about this book, if you didn't know this. This is one of 2 books in the Bible where God is not explicitly mentioned in the book. We're not going to go through here and see that God said this. God seems on the surface to be absent from this book. But here's the thing that we need to know, and this is where I think one of the exciting things about a book like this is that when it feels like God's not present, God's present and working behind the scenes. Even next week, we're going to end the service off next week with Waymaker, because even when I can't see you, you're working. God is pulling strings and making things happen. And, oh, is that a circumstance? No, it's not a surprise coincidence. It's God showing up and doing something when we don't see it. Know this, when you feel it the most, we're like, well, God just doesn't care about me. God's not there. God's absolutely there. You might need to just take a moment of taking a deeper look of where is God and what is God doing. But before we start reading the passage this morning, would you repeat after me? Heavenly Father, your word is written in my mind and hidden in my heart. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. I will seek you with all of my strength. My greatest desire is to be a disciple and to make more disciples. I will live my life according to your word. Your word, O Lord, is eternal. We're going to start with Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were complete, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods, and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. I'm just going to say this right now, just so moving forward. There's this king, depending on the version of the Bible you read, will identify him by his Persian name or by his Greek name. You're probably more familiar with Xerxes, and Xerxes is much easier for me to pronounce. So instead of continuing to say, that's tongue-tied. He's King Xerxes now. Are we good? I'll remind everybody each week when his name pops up. I'm just going to call him and read King Xerxes just because it is easier for me to do that. So there's a vast amount of land that King Xerxes is over. This is covered by about 20 individual countries to this day. And in this moment, there's 127 provinces that operate over this land. And so all these things are being said to impress us. If this is how impressive that King Xerxes is. This is what he's doing. This is the land that he covers. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about it is he is throwing a big party. 180-day long party. 180 days, that's half of a year, is designated to throwing this very lavish, very big party. Now, the story of the book of Esther occurs between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, after the temple was constructed, but before Ezra himself came to Jerusalem and stopped the mixed marriages. So now back to Xerxes. He's in his 30s. He throws this party. And we don't really know why he's throwing it, but he's throwing it for his advisors. He's throwing it for those that are in charge of the 127 provinces. Basically, like, come here and let me show you why I'm king and why I am so great. But there's never a particular reason. Is he trying to prepare for something? Is he trying to prepare for battle so he can take some more land? And he's trying to get everybody to be rallied behind what he wants to do. We're not really sure why. We just know that he is going over the top with how he's presenting things. Then he finishes the 180-day long party, and what does he do? He has another party for 7 more days. This guy likes the party. And when we look at it, we see that this company is a little bit different now. Now everyone from Susa can come and they can dine. And it's a spectacle when they arrive. This is one of those moments where you're like, I may not like the king, I may not like what he has to say. I may not like his agenda, but I just want to go and see this thing. And so you have people that are showing up, because when we look at verse 6, we see the white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars and couches of gold and silver. Like if you say, hey, can I go to the king's house and see this couch made of gold? It's going to hurt to sit on. It's not going to be comfortable, but I want to go see a couch made out of gold. Or this idea that there are these beautiful hangings that you see this purple cloth. Purple today, not a big deal to us. But in that time period, a purple cloth actually meant that you were royalty, because to make purple cloth was difficult and it was expensive. And in this passage, you have this moment where the king has made an edict about drinking. And so it's according to the law. He issues an edict. And notice in this story, you're going to see edicts come up multiple different times, and we're going to hit this a couple times even in this particular message. But he puts an edict out there where typically in a situation like this, it's how much can you drink and when can you drink. Basically, King Xerxes says, you can drink whatever, whenever, don't stop drinking. How many of you know when situations like that, where that much alcohol is flowing, people make bad decisions? They make bad choices and things where they regret the next day. They wake up and like, did I really do that? We're going to see King Xerxes make one of these decisions in just a couple minutes. Vashti, the queen, is over hosting a separate party for the concubines. That already tells you that this story is going into a difficult spot very quickly, that it's not just that he has a wife, he has wife and concubines. And so now in this moment, the queen is throwing a party while this big party is going on for all the people. The queen's over here throwing a party for all of the concubines that Xerxes can call over whenever he wants to and say, I want to spend the night with this one. And so she's having to throw a party for all the other women that her husband's sleeping with. I told you, this story gets interesting. This story gets very drama-filled very quickly. And so we see the king's riches, we see the glory, we see the splendor. He's on top of the world. What else is there to do? We're going to see this right now. This is on the verse 10 of chapter 1. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. I mean, hear that. Like I said, that much alcohol that long, it's not going to end pretty. He commanded Mehuman, Bishta, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethra, and Carcass. How many of you are glad that none of those are your names? The 7 eunuchs, how many of you are glad you're not a eunuch? No, who served in the presence of King Xerxes to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. I'm going to come back to that. Hold the word royal crown in your mind for a moment. In order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshina, Shethra, Admantha, Tarshish, Marcina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Xerxes delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but against all of the officials and all the people who are in the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. That's a lot to unpack right there. Basically, here's what happens. Queen Vashti has a refusal. She's basically at the moment of enough is enough. I am not going before the king in this moment. What's really happening here? He's drunk. It says his heart is merry with wine. This is the 7th day that this party has been going on. On 180 days preceded this. He is definitely not in his right mind of what he's trying to do. And he wants to now display kind of the capstone on the capstone party that he wants to show off his queen. And now if you remember, I said hold on to these two words, royal crown. He sends his 7 messengers to go and get her, to bring her back. And that, I just want to even read this again because I want you to hear it. To bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the people and the princess her beauty. This isn't 100, it's not in Scripture, but the rabbinical teachings, the belief of the rabbis at the time period, when they said royal crown, what is really being referenced here? That she is to come before all of the people wearing nothing but the royal crown. Why do you think Vashti didn't want to show up? She knew what was going on. She knew that she was about to be paraded, that even if it's not that, she was about to be humiliated. She wanted nothing more to do with this king, and she knew the consequences, that to go before this king, or to not go before the king, would really be a bad situation. But she says, enough is enough. I'm not going there. I'm not doing this. And now all of a sudden she's sent away. That the attendants are waiting to try and bring her back. She's not coming back. Xerxes hears this. He's upset. And what would it have looked like? I imagine it's like one of those scenes in a drama or a movie where there's a room full of people and everyone's relaxed and there's soft music playing and everyone's just waiting. And then all of a sudden, someone stands up and says something completely inappropriate, and it takes all of the air out of the room of like, what just happened and what do I do? And I want out of this room right now, but I can't really walk out of this room, and I don't like the tension. How many of you love tension? Let me just ask this. Like, you love it when things get tense, and you're like, let me get the popcorn, and I just want to sit here. How many of you, when things get tense, you're like, what is the quickest way out? Like, is there 10 different exits, and which one can I get to quickest? And how do I disappear and nobody ever see me ever again? That a lot of times is me, like, let me just get out of here because this is uncomfortable, and I don't want to be here. And so the king's unhappy that she's not coming. True to his nature, he gets angry, very angry. And then in this moment, he sits with his 7 counselors, his top people, and they are having a conversation of how he is to handle his marriage issues. Let me just say this. If initially when something goes wrong, if your go-to is to go to 7 other individuals and say, what should I do? And all their instant reply is, well, because she didn't listen to you and all the other women might get a good idea of not listening to their husbands, you should banish her. Probably not the best people to go to it for advice. And so he makes this edict that basically she can never come again into his presence, which is going to cause an issue in just a moment. This brings us to Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. After these things, when the anger of King Xerxes had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Let me just stop for a second. They're basically saying, hey, at the height of your emotion, when you're upset about something, here's some solid good advice. This is good advice for everybody. When you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, don't make life-altering decisions. It's the HALT principle. If you're hungry, go grab a Snickers. If you're angry, go for a walk. If you're lonely, wait until you're around people that you can actually put your trust and your belief into that will speak wisdom into you. If you're tired, go take a nap and then make the decision. But if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you are going to make a bad decision. And here we have the king who's making a bad decision, and the individuals that are surrounding him that basically said, banish Vashti, and then let's bring in all the beautiful virgins from all over this massive country, and we're going to find you a new queen. He's not taking good advice here. Verse 3, and let the kings a king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and the edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Xerxes after being 12 months under the regulation for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young women went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take from her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as her own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Xerxes into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So what happens when the king cools off? He realizes, I made a mistake. He kind of has some second thoughts, and what he realizes is, though, he made a decree. And when one of these kings from Persia, when they made a decree, there was no taking that decree back. It's the reason why, like, he makes that decree about the alcohol. Everybody can drink whatever they want to. He makes that decree about Vashti. Then she can't come back into his presence. Where have we seen this play out before? Daniel in the lion's den. That Ahasuerus, known as by his Greek name Xerxes, is the son of Darius, who was tricked into putting Daniel into the lion's den. And in that moment with Darius, when he puts Daniel in the lion's den, he instantly knows, I've done something wrong. I didn't know what I was getting into, and there's nothing I can do. Because he made a decree, he made law, and then this is stuck, this is going to happen. So in this moment, we have Xerxes who makes a decree. Vashti can't come back in his presence. Even though he's the king, he can't just say, let me undo this edict. In my mind, I would like to say, if I'm the king, and I made a decree, then I can just make a decree that the first decree didn't count as a decree because I was tricked. But for some reason, that's just not what it worked. Once it's said, it has to lay out, it has to happen. So they begin this whole process then of looking for the replacement for Vashti, and all these virgins from all over are brought in. And we know that we're about to be introduced to this great character of Esther, but before we do, we meet Mordecai, the Jew. Here's one of the things we got to realize about Mordecai. Whoever is writing this, whether it's Mordecai or one of his contemporaries or somebody else altogether, they're identifying Mordecai immediately as a Jew. Like, imagine just walking around like, hi, I'm Scott the American. that I'm Scott the this. Like, he's known as Mordecai the Jew. And so he gets that designation. Everybody knows who he is, that he's taking care of his cousin, raising his cousin as his own daughter because her parents have died. And he hears about this and says, okay, Esther, you should go into this. Remember the fact that Mordecai is being identified by his Jewish name. Esther is being identified by her Persian name. She's a Jew. She's holding to Jewish ideals. But even her name, nobody knows that she's Jewish. So she finds favor with Haggai. He treats her well, promotes her up, and takes care of her. And she begins to prepare and go through this year-long process of getting ready to go before the king. And in this moment, we realize the fact of how is she going through 12 months of preparation in this capacity, and nobody knows that she's Jewish. How do you pull that off? How do you pull that off when you're supposed to be doing sacrifices and celebrating feasts? And it kind of gives you this feeling of like, is she trying to wear a mask? Is she trying to hide who she really is? And I think all of us can relate to that to some degree of, this is who I am, this is what my beliefs are, but if I tell this person what I really believe, it's going to cost me an opportunity, but I really do believe this way, and you feel torn of, I don't know which way to go. One of the things I love about Esther, and we're going to see it throughout this entire book, is that Esther is constantly dealing with this struggle and this pull back and forth of, should I go this way or should I go that way? So often when we read the Bible, almost all of us, I would say, I don't want to say everybody, but I know I'm guilty of this, that we read about certain individuals, and I really like that part of their story. So I'm going to read into it. One of my best examples of this is David fighting Goliath. Everybody wants to be David, that little boy who has the faith that I'm going to go before the giant, and I'm going to grab a stone, and I'm going to throw it back, and with the help of God, I'm going to slay my giants. And you hear sermons on that kind of topic of, here's how you can slay your giants. But none of us ever read the story of David and Goliath and like, man, I'm Goliath. I'm getting in somebody else's way. I'm messing up somebody else's life. I think so often we might be David in moments. I think a lot of times we're also Goliath and we're causing issues for other people and we don't want to deal with our own self. That we're getting in God's way and preventing God's people from being able to move. But we say, oh, but I'm David. You don't understand. I'm David. Okay, that's fine. David also slept with Bathsheba. Are you that part of the David too? But when we look at the story of Esther, one of the things I like about it is compared to a lot of individuals in the Bible, I do authentically believe we can kind of put ourselves into Esther's story. Because Esther's story is kind of boiled down to just a couple of short years. We can look at it and say, I can relate with that. I've been there before. I've done that before. We look at individuals through Scripture where we have Daniel, and he was commended for not eating the king's unkosher food because he was Jewish. We have his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who wouldn't bow to the idol because they were Jewish, and they made it known. We have Moses, who forsook his Egyptian upbringing so that he could experience the suffering with God's people. And then we have Esther, who's not telling anyone that she's Jewish, and she's rising up in popularity. So often we push Esther like she's great and she's fantastic and she's a great role model. She's also kind of playing both sides of the fence here. And so we look through this and we kind of feel a little bit uncomfortable. How is this supposedly godly girl fitting in so well with the godless culture around her? And so we look through her story. She is kind of moving along. She's moving towards this direction of this ultimate date with the king. And that when we look at verse 11, we also see that Mordecai is still kind of hanging around. See, a lot of times we give Mordecai this props of like, you are a great individual, Mordecai. You're taking care of Esther. Mordecai allowed for her to go into the household of the king to ultimately, here's what's going to happen. And we read it, and it may not have clicked in your mind when you heard it. These young virgins are going to have, after a year of preparation, one night to sleep with the king with the goal of making the king fall in love with them. And if the king doesn't fall in love with them, they don't get to go home. They get to become a concubine of the king. So we don't know how long this process goes on for. Is Esther the 10th woman? Is she the 20th? Is she the 100th? We don't get that detail. But all of these women before her took their turn. They weren't appointed queen, and so they joined the growing household of the concubines. And so Mordecai allows Esther to go into this mess. And you kind of like, Mordecai, like, you're supposed to be watching out for her. She's your cousin, that her parents have died. Like, why are you allowing this? You feel a little bit better because verse 11 told us that he keeps coming by. He keeps checking on her, like trying to take care of her. I think it's a little bit misguided what he's doing, but I think he is looking out for her best interests, but he's telling her, don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. Like, it makes you sit back and wonder, like, Mordecai, like, what's your angle here? What are you trying to do? What do you know or what do you not know about what's going on here? And it makes you wonder, and we're going to see this presented a little bit next week, is Mordecai trying to play an angle that's best for him? Because when we hit chapter 3, you're going to see a promotion that Mordecai thinks he deserves but doesn't get the promotion. So after 12 months, Esther goes through all of this beautifying and preparation. And just like an episode of The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, she goes in before the king and says, here I am, would you love me? And she sleeps with the king. The king's pleased with her, says, you get to be my queen. And then what does he do? He throws a party and says that there's no more taxes and we're going to throw a feast for Esther. And he goes into this whole strategy and idea of like, I have the new queen. See, this is probably a way that you've never heard Esther preach before, because normally we like glossing over chapters 1 and 2 and let's get right to Esther for such a time as this. I do believe that Esther is being set up for just a time as this, but what I really want to encourage you with all of this is when you have moments in your life where like that feels like it's messy. God sees the mess and sees an opportunity of how can I take the mess and how can I use it for my glory? And I want to encourage you with this because I think you might be feeling like I can relate with Esther a little bit more. Not that you're going off prepping for a year, the sleep with a king to become a queen. I'm not saying that's your plan and strategy in life, but the fact is saying I'm walking through struggles and I don't understand and I'm trying to hear God's voice. And so far, you've heard the vast majority of chapter 1 and 2 already preach. You haven't heard God's name mentioned anywhere. So it's this feeling of I'm going through all the motions, but God, where are you and what do you want me to do and how am I supposed to act and how am I supposed to behave? And this is where I want to kind of set up the beginning of the end of this message. It's kind of a cliffhanger that Mordecai discovers a plot. Every week I'm almost going to kind of like leave this like episodic version of preaching, is leave you on a little cliffhanger of like, here's what's coming next week. So I'm not going to read the full passage. This is verses 19 through 23, though. You see, Mordecai is standing in the gate of the king's court, and he was at this gate where the official business was being conducted, that judicial verdicts were rendered here. And how did he get here? Esther is now queen, and most likely Esther appointed Mordecai to this position. So it starts making you wonder, like, Mordecai, again, what are you up to? What's your play here? What's your angle? Are you really taking care of Esther? Are you trying to set up your family for the long run? And you kind of get this, like, Mordecai, what you doing here? And he's there and he's paying attention and he hears a couple of individuals that are high up that they're making an assassination plot against the king. Mordecai hears this plot going on. He goes to Esther. He shares with Esther what's going on. Esther goes to the king. She shares what's going on. And then the king has the perpetrators hung. That Mordecai's heroic deeds are written in a book and then are promptly forgotten about. Imagine somebody saves your life and you're just like, I'm very, very thankful for Mordecai. I'm going to write about it in my journal. And then I'm going to forget about it because, like, not that big of a deal. He only saved my life. He only prevented me from being put to death. But it's okay. And that's where we end chapter 2. And so you hear it, and it's like, okay, where's the inspirational thing? What's my takeaway today? How am I supposed to look more like Jesus? How am I supposed to follow after God a little bit more? And here's where I want to take it today. This is where I want to kind of leave it with you today, is a story of two kings and their kingdoms. You hear this and you think, well, you're just talking one king and one kingdom today, two kings and their kingdoms. Because the thing I said in the beginning of this message today is that God, his name is absent from this book. We don't read through it and see God speaking to this or God doing this. We don't see Jesus in this book because it's an Old Testament book. So is God absent from this book? Absolutely not. Here's what God would have us do as we make our way through this book that doesn't feature his name. That God is relentlessly inviting us to compare two kings and their kingdoms as we read this story. The first king is obviously Xerxes and his kingdom, that he is full of party, he's full of himself, he's full of showing, here's all of my fancy things. And if you fit the right mold, if you do all the right things, if you don't mess up, if you listen to me, you get all of these things. Or you at least get to come in for a little bit for a party. The other king would be who we would identify as our King of Kings, who's greater than all kings, and that's Jesus. You see, sometimes you need someone who's set up where this is the king, this is supposed to be someone who's good, this is supposed to be someone who has ability, and we see this person set up and we realize, but there's a coming soon King of Kings and Lord of Lords who is capable and greater than everyone who comes before him. When we look at these stories between King Jesus and King Xerxes, what do we see? King Xerxes' kingdom enslaves, extorts, degrades, and shames. Christ's kingdom frees, enriches, cleanses, and exalts. It is pure religion and it is glorious. You see, for Xerxes, it's about him. For Jesus, it's about getting us back to him. When Xerxes throws a party, it is a desperate attempt to win respect and bolster the glory of his throne. When Jesus sets a table, a wedding feast for those whose worship he has already rightly secured. We come into the presence of God Almighty and say, because of who Jesus is, because of what Jesus did on the cross on my behalf, I get to participate in this feast. I don't have to impress anybody. I don't have to do anything. I just get to be present with Jesus. With Xerxes, that's not the case. It's you come into my presence and you need to impress me. We're going to see it with Esther later on in this book, that if Esther doesn't come in the appropriate way, Xerxes can just have her banished like Vashti, or killed for coming into his presence in the wrong way. Jesus is begging us to come into his presence. And so often in our lives, it's just this matter of saying, well, I'm afraid that, if I come to God the wrong way, or if I mess up and then I tell God he's going to be upset with me. No, God wants you to come to him because he wants to restore you and set you free. It's the complete opposite of Xerxes. Where Xerxes abuses and uses and strips and degrades his bride, Christ washes, clothes, cleanses, adorns, nourishes, and cherishes his bride. That we can look at this and say, well, Xerxes, these are all the things he's doing. He's making these people go through a show. And you've got to come to me and you've got to be perfect in my presence before I'll even entertain a notion of spending any time with you. We look at Christ in the New Testament. Christ is going to those who desperately need to spend that time and meeting with them first and loving them and caring for them and saying, now go and sin no more. Christ doesn't expect them to be perfect before he meets with them. He meets with them and then says, now change your life, change your path, stop living a life of sin. The complete opposite. Xerxes' bride is reduced to an object to be used and jeered at, a sexual trophy to impress the king's friends. Jesus' bride is brought forward in smiling splendor, her dignity clothed and restored in resurrected glory. Here's one of the things I need us to realize as this church and as the church, even greater than the American church, like that big C church, Christians around the world, we need to realize that we as the church are the bride of Christ. And as that, we need to live a certain way because we are preparing ourselves to spend eternity with him forever. And he already is setting up the table. He's already building the mansion. He's already taking care of everything. And we just need to say, okay, God, I love you. I care about you. Be in my life. And when we look at it, it changes who we are. This is the reason why we can't keep going back and doing the same thing over and over and over again. We have to see change. And all of a sudden, when we say, Jesus, would you be present in my life? Would you do what only you can do? When we allow that to happen, we're amazed at the difference in our lives. Where Xerxes' word goes out in silliness and returns utterly void, Christ's word goes out in power, and not one syllable returns void, returns without accomplishing its intended intent. Xerxes will speak, and you have these declarations, these edicts that he makes, and we can listen to it like, that's just dumb. He makes an edict about Vashti. You can't come back into my presence again, but he can't undo his edict by saying, you know what? I was dumb last night. I was drunk, and I made a bad decision. And so now because of that, I've got to completely change my entire life. And everybody knows I'm the king, and I can just say and do whatever I want to say and do, but I can't, so I'm actually utterly powerless. I can have all the things, but I'm ultimately powerless, where when God speaks through his word, not a single word will ever come back void. That God is not revoking his promises, but it's up to us whether we're going to accept his promises. If the worship team will come forward. Here's where I want to encourage you today. This is where I want to leave this message, because there's a lot that's going to be coming up in chapters 3 all the way to the end of the book. And next week is just going to be chapter 3, so make sure, read chapter 3 for next week. But so often in our own individual lives, it's easy to sit back and say, okay, God, well, this is what I'm going to do, and I might make mistakes, but it kind of is what it is, and my past is my past, and I can't move past my past. The past is in your past, and you have the choice of saying whether I'm going to continue to live in my past and my failures and my mistakes, or am I going to go running back to God? Because God will forgive our past. All you have to do is think of the parable of the prodigal son, where the prodigal son was sitting at a spot and saying, you know what, I've messed up, I've made mistakes, and it would be better for me to be a servant in my father's household than to continue living the way that I'm living. And for each and every one of us, when we hear this, we can already kind of identify Esther's not quite living the life that she should be living, because she's hiding who her faith is in. She's a Jew. She believes in God, that we're going to see her backing up this belief as we go, but she's kind of hiding it. She's not really being who she's fully supposed to be. She's going to get there, but she's not currently. We can look at Mordecai, and we can see someone who is identified as a Jew. His trademark feature is he's Mordecai the Jew. But all of a sudden, well, you're pushing your own agenda here. What are you trying to get, Mordecai? We can look at Xerxes, who's putting his focus on all the things except for God. And you say, well, he's not a Jew. Why should he look at it? Because Darius, his father, when you go back to this whole Daniel in the lion's den, if you go back and read the story, Daniel chapter 6, you get to the end, Darius declares in an edict that Daniel's God is the God. And then his son Xerxes misses the boat. And so we can look at these three individuals, they're all missing it, and ultimately they're all getting in their own way. Here's where I want to encourage you, just as the worship team just leads us in a song, is get out of the way and allow God to be who God is. I don't know what that means for you as an individual. It might mean I just need to get out of my way and I need to stop doing this sin. It might mean, you know what, God has called me to do this. I know God has called me to do this, that God is not absent, that God is present, and he's telling me, do this, but I'm choosing not to because I'm in my own way, because I don't know if that's comfortable. I don't know if that's what I want. Whatever it is, if you're in the way of God moving, get out of the way of God moving. There is no better place than to be moving along with God. All of us, I think, experienced the snow on this past Friday. Lydia, Quinn, and myself, we were walking out of Target back to our car, and just the way the wind was in that particular moment, it was almost like sleet that was coming down, but it was just whipping. And the entire way, we had to walk like 3/4 of the parking lot to get to our car, and it was just whipping in my face this entire time. You know that like look where you've got to kind of look down because you can't really take it in your face any longer. But you also have to look up because you're like holding the hands of two small children and you're walking through a parking lot and you're not looking if there's cars anywhere. And you're kind of doing like one of these like I don't want to get hit. I don't have like ski goggles on. Like I can't just look up. In that moment, what would have been the easier way of walking? Turn around and walk in the opposite direction where all the pain is at my back and I'm not walking into the pain. God wants you to go with him instead of pushing up against him. God's using things in your life to sharpen you and to move you in a different direction. Get out of God's way and move in the way that God's called you to move. Amen? I want you to stand. I want to worship. The altars are open this morning. Nobody's asking you any questions, but if you say, you know what, I need to just get down on the altar and say, Jesus, I will get out of the way, move in my life, come down to the altar, raise your hands and worship, but let's give glory to the King of Kings this morning.
How great